Hi guys, welcome to the solution video for Workout Wednesday 2020, week 2, where we build a beautiful and dynamic bar chart. The challenge for this week is to construct a bar chart where you can click on different metrics and you can also change the date granularity or aggregation on the bar chart. The focus of this week is on parameters and formatting. Those are the two main objectives that we'll be going through. Okay, so let me go ahead and dive into recreating the challenge. So the first thing that I would focus on is building the different parameters. So I know we're going to have two different parameters. One is going to be to select the date types or the date ranges, and the other one will be for the metric. So let's start by building out that first one where we select our metric. Now, I always use integers because they're easy to type in and make it really fast for case statements. So those are our three metrics. Now when we build the parameter, nothing happens when we use this. If I were to show the parameter control and I start changing, nothing happens because it's not connected to anything and I don't have anything on my actual sheet, so nothing is in my visualization. So we always need to connect the parameter to a calculated field. So I will build out a calculated field, and this is just going to be called selected metric. And we're going to use a case statement. Okay. Now, as I'm typing this case statement, you may have been curious as to why I was summing the sales. Well, I know that profit ratio is already an aggregated metric. So that means that everything I have in my calculated field either needs to be pre-aggregated or row level. Since profit ratio is an aggregated metric, I'm going to go ahead and aggregate my other two metrics. So my sales becomes the sum of sales, and my items per order, which is the sum of the quantity over the count distinct of the order ID, comes here. You could also build separate calculated fields for the items per order and put it in that way and do sort of a nested reference. That's a preference thing. So that's your call. Okay, so that's kind of step one. And if I bring that on to rows, now when I change between sales and profit ratio and items per order, we can see that my axis is changing and so is my selected metric. So the next step is to actually build out another parameter that is the date ranges. So select date range, select dates. And we'll do the same thing. This will be an integer. And so I believe we had, going back to our original, we had last 12 months, last 13 weeks, and last 14 days. Same thing, if I were to show this parameter control and I switch between this, nothing is happening because this isn't connected to anything. So what we want to do is we actually want to build out basically a date filter that's going to evaluate and return an amount of data based on what we select. And maybe I'll even put order date on so that we can see how this date filter is actually going to work. So this is all the data. It goes from the beginning of 2016 all the way to the end of 2019. Okay, so I like to build out Boolean calculations and use those. So here's our first one. This is true false to determine the last 12 months. Now another convention I typically do is I build out custom dates. So you can see I'm using custom dates here. So this order date by months, and I am evaluating the difference between these. Now I also said in the post that we needed to have a date to reference. Now, typically, if we were doing this in a business environment, that date might be today, but for the sake of this challenge, we can go ahead and just have it be a static parameter, which is kind of what I said from a specification perspective. So let me build that parameter as well, and we'll just call it date. And this one will be a date. And I think I told you guys to pick maybe the 1st of January. Okay, now let's build the custom dates. And the reason why I like to build custom dates by right-clicking, going to custom date, is you can truncate your date or get the date part really quickly. You don't have to write any calculated fields. So if I do the order date months, the date value, it's truncating my date back to the month. So today is January 11th, 2020. So if I truncated it to the month, it would be January 1, 2020. So I do that, and I'll actually go ahead and do that for our weeks as well. So we can do week numbers. And we can do a custom one for the days. The days is maybe not necessarily needed, but I like doing it, especially if you want to get around like date hierarchies. I think I've talked about this in the past. That's a great way to build those out. Okay, so let's now build our first calculated field, our true false last 12 months. And I'm just going to copy this from before so that you don't have to watch me type. And so all this is saying is that the order date and month should be less than or equal to, add a -1 month to our date parameter that's truncated to the month, subtracted by 1, obviously, and then it should be greater than that as well. And let me actually build out our date filter now. And we'll just start with that so that I can bring this on and show you what this is going to look like. So I've built out the Boolean condition, and there's another case statement for our date parameter this time, our date selection parameter. And now you can see that it's either null, false, or true. So if I select true, it should be the case that when I switch it to last 12 months, that we see data that is within the last 12 months. So it looks like we're starting at January 1, 2019, and we're going through the end of December 2019. Now, I got a little panicked because it was on last 13 weeks, and we don't have a condition for that. So there is no true data at that point. But not to worry, we just switched our parameter. Okay, so we're going to build the same one for weeks as well. Now, there was some feedback that I saw on Twitter, which I think is great to call out, around how you want to handle partial weeks. So this solution does not care about partial weeks. If you select a date and there is a partial week, that last week will be partial. If you wanted that to be different, that would be something additional that you would want to take into consideration as you build this. And then our last 14 days. This is all very similarly written, right? We've just got the date ranges here, the in-between, and that's kind of the niceness of having both the date trunk and then using those custom dates is it makes it really easy for someone else to read your calculated fields to see what you're doing. Okay. Now, all we need to do is put those other two into our date filters. So let me go ahead and add those. And we're almost halfway there. So if I switch this, then this is obviously changing to the last 13 weeks and the last 14 days. It's still showing by the day here, so that's the next thing we need to solve. But we've got our metrics switching as well. So to get it to be the aggregated day or date part that we want, the first step we would do is actually very similar. So date part or date to show, and this is our case statement again. So select dates when 1, then this is where the custom dates also become handy. And let me go ahead and bring that on to our column shelf so you can see it. Now it's going to just like because it's used as a normal date, so you can see it's a date field, Tableau is going to make it by whatever like highest aggregation or date part it has. So it's going to default to year, but you can just set it to exact date, and you can even make this discrete. I think it's going to be discrete for our final solution anyway. And I'll make it a bar chart just because we know we're making a bar chart. So now when I switch between last 14 days and last 13 weeks and last 12 months, we can see the date down at the bottom is changing. So when it's in months, it's the beginning of the month. When it's the weeks, it's the first day of the week. And when it's days, it's just days. So now we're really getting close to a solution. The final thing I did to make this tricky with regards to the dates was actually to put some additional formatting on it. So when we look back at the original, you can see that if I switch between the different selections, that the header of the date actually switches to 3 different customized components, and then they are not what they would look like by default. So to do that, all we need to do is build one more calculation. This is going to be a string calculated field, so use this with caution because string calculations can be a bit slow. But for this one, I think it pays off in terms of what we're actually doing as a result. So for this, let me change my parameter here. So I'll actually copy this because this is from our solution workbook, and we'll go through it again. And let me take our select date. Okay, so what we're saying here is if it is set to the months, then we're going to take the date name of the month of whatever the order date is that's already truncated the month. So date name is going to return the actual name. You can see it in the function here. So date name month of the example is going to return the word April. So all we need to do is take the left 3 characters of that And then we're going to take the right two characters of the year. So if the year were 2019, 2019, we're going to take the right two characters. That's 19. We're adding a space and then a single quote within that for just like the apostrophe on the date. But that's all we're really doing there. And then we do something very similar for the next two. So for the next one, you can do this many ways. There's actually, you can use the week function as well. You don't have to use date name. If it's the weeks, then I've gone in and said, it's the week plus, and then this piece, which is just the date name of the week by the week number. And again, using those custom truncated dates becomes really helpful here because you're going to get the right stuff all the time. And then the same thing with the month. Or with the date, the individual day. We're just taking the month and we are finding it, and then we are adding on the day. And again, these are all strings to get them to show up because we've got sort of that mixed text. Some of it says like October, some of it says week, and some of it has the dates as a slash. So now if I take our string date and I put that here instead, you will see as I toggle through it that we've got everything now shown correctly. I'm going to go ahead and make this bolder for you and a little bit bigger for the demo. This does not match the final formatting, but it'll be easier for you guys to see this. Now, notice what happened when I set it to month, last 12 months. It goes April, then August, then December. So it's alphabetical because it's a string, because it's not a date. When it's last 13 weeks, it's not a big deal because week is always the same, and then it evaluates the numbers, which are, alphabetical. And the last 14 days, we're pretty good with what these are. But to ensure that we actually get this right, what I would actually go in and do is sort this. So if we choose our field to sort by, we're going to pick the order date. And we'll choose the minimum here. Now we're going to sort our string date field always on the minimum order date. And as we switch through these, we'll see these are now in chronological order. So January 19 all the way up through December 19. And that'll change whenever our dates change for our final solution. So that will always work. That's a key step if you're going to be using strings for date headers as opposed to dates themselves. Okay, so we're really close to the finish line here. The other two main components, one is another formatting element, and the other one is the parameter action to actually change the metric itself. So let's go ahead, because we've talked a lot about formatting, and let's walk through what that final format calculation will be. So let me go ahead and bring up the solution and talk through what I'm describing. So the other key kicker on this is if you select a metric, it's going to look, the number formatting on the label is going to look different. You'll notice intentionally there is no y-axis because we wouldn't have control over formatting the y-axis independently when we've got one calculated field or field on the y-axis. It's always going to look the same format and it won't be pretty. So what we want to do is we actually want to build out a way to format these differently. And I've got some specifications. If it's sales, then we want it to be numbers. We want there to be a $sign. We want there to be commas if it's in the thousands, and if it were in the millions even. You can see what that looks like when we go up. I don't think there's anything in the millions, but it is what we would expect it to be, human readable currency. Profit ratio, we want it to be a percentage with 1 decimal precision, and items per order is a decimal, is the same thing. It's a float with 1 decimal precision. So to do that, we're going to lean on formatting, calculations, and string calcs one more time. And I'm going to show you what that final solution looks like, and then we can talk through how it works. So here is our final solution. And I'm going to go ahead and just put it into our new workbook here and change this parameter. Okay. So in my blog post, I said, hey, use regex when you can. So the reason regex is valuable is particularly for this first scenario where we have currency and we want to automatically put in commas. Traditionally, if you wanted to scale out numbers that went from millions to thousands down to maybe just tens of dollars or single-digit dollars, you'd have to write these very long if statements that dealt with how the numbers actually function. You'd be evaluating the length of the number and then essentially inserting commas in the different places. But what regex does is it looks for patterns of your data and then does that insertion. So what you see is actually a much smaller calculation or function that provides the same results, and it actually scales out. So if we were to have billions and trillions, it would still work. We wouldn't have to write in those scenarios, so it becomes extremely handy. Now, I won't get into the nuts and bolts of what the expression does, but trust me when I say that this expression right here, this component, is what you need to be able to add in the comma to your dollars based on the size of it. So it's basically looking for patterns, and when it finds those patterns, it's going to do these different components and add them in there. Now, number 2 and number 3. So number 2 is just for the percentage. So to do that, basically what we do is we take that number and we multiply it by 100 because it's in a small format. So it's already expressed as a decimal. So 10% is 0.10, so we need to multiply that by 100 to first get the 10, and then we do some rounding off of that to make sure we have the right number of decimal precision for that percentage, and then we add the percent sign to the right. The last one's actually probably the most simplistic because we just have items per order, which is already just a normal float number with a decimal, so we just need to round that and convert it to a string. Let me go ahead and bring that on to our label so that you can see what that looks like, and again, I'll make it a little bit bolder and bigger. Okay, so now when I switch between sales and profit ratio and items per order, that looks nice. And you can even see that y-axis on the left, what's on our row shelf, that axis, we don't have control over the formatting on it. I wish we did, but we don't. So the trick that we're using here is we're actually just going to hide it. We're not going to show it. And we're going to lean on the title of the visualization, the title of the sheet itself to express what metric we're looking at. So there's no real additional value that we need when looking over on that left-hand side for an axis. We've got all the labels. We can see the comparison among the heights of the bar, so we're pretty good on that component. There is some formatting that happens, so the only other thing that was kind of done in the final solution, and I'll just bring that up to show you, is if we switch to profit ratio, and let me actually go to maybe last 14 days. We've got this line here that's not an axis line, but it shows up always at the 0 depending on whatever metric we've got. So it looks like an axis line there, but here we know it's more like a 0 line because it's actually moving up in line with the data. I like this because it seems like the bars are coming up and down from 0. Traditionally, if you were to use the axis lines in Tableau, the axis line would always be down here, which would not necessarily look cool or pretty. You can do this 2 ways. The way you could do it with formatting is to go into lines and set your 0 lines. You'll notice that I did not do that because I found when it rendered on Tableau Public, it didn't always show the lines. So instead, what I ended up doing was actually building out a reference line. So you can see I have a reference line at 0. It's constant. This is newer feature, right? Newer functionality. We can turn the tooltip off. The label we could have always turned off, and we can set the line. Formatting. So then now only me and you know that this is a reference line at 0. You might know if you were to hover and see how it looks, but it sits quite nicely and will always show up on our visualizations and always shows up at 0, independent or regardless of what metric we're on. So that's kind of awesome. Okay. So the last step in this process is maybe the part that's the most tricky and got you hung up. These parts are actually quite easy because these are just parameters. So this title is just inserting those 2 different parameters to make that dynamic title. So that's actually pretty easy for us at this point, or it should be. But the last piece is really being able to select these different metrics and change which one is in the visualization. Now, I'll caveat and say there are several ways to do this. The way I did this, and I mentioned this in the blog post, you may not feel comfortable with. I'm leaning on some of the other data that's in the Superstore data set. But I just want to give you a feel for how you could do it. You could certainly construct it a separate way. I think there's many, many solutions to this. The basic premise of this is when we click on a metric, we want the circle to fill in. So it's normally a circle that has no color inside, but when we click it, it's going to color in, and then similarly, the bar chart is going to change. So the first step is obviously dynamically clicking on something should change the parameter. That in and of itself is a parameter action. So let me show you how that would look. So we're basically saying when you click on something in the parameter legend, we want to target that metric parameter. That's where we have that integer, that 1, 2, 3 for whichever metric. and we are going to change it. Now we're going to change it based off of this field. You can pick the field that you want it to be based off of. Here's the fields that are in my visualization or in my workbook that are on this visualization, the parameter legend that we can change. You will have to set an aggregation. You can set it to none. So for me, what I did to do this was I set up the parameter legend, and then I have a field called the minimum metric value and the minimum. Basically, what's in the metric value is either 1, 2, or 3, depending on which metric it is here, and that matches up to what they are in the parameter dropdown. So the minimum metric value for sales is 1, the min metric value for profit ratio is 2, and so on. And then I'm just re-aggregating it to the minimum. So that's kind of step 1 of the functionality. Now, step 2 is how we actually get this implemented. So what I chose to do was actually take some of our other dimensions in there, specifically one that has 3 different values, so segment, and case them out to be different items. So when it's consumer, it's actually sales. When it's corporate, it's actually profit ratio. When it's home office, it's actually items per order. And I use that to construct our selector. This is a shape sheet. So we've got items on shape, we've got items on color, and then we've got our parameter measure, that measure name. On columns, it's hidden so that they are spaced evenly. Now, the next item I did was this metric value. So this is what I talked about before. It's a very simple case statement. When it's sales, then it's 1. When it's profit ratio, it's 2. When it's items per order, it's 3. And the reason I had to do this was because I found that I couldn't really reference measure names and measure values. So I went down the path of actually just putting the measure names, because you can use measure names to change your parameters, but I couldn't use the measure values of those to change them how I was trying to do it. Now, I may just not have been doing it right, but that was what I found to be the limitation for myself. So I decided to go down this path, and this made a lot more sense. So I have my minimum metric value, which again is just 1, 2, or 3, depending on the metric. And then I have this final calculation, this true false shape, because that was the big thing here, is none of this would have been necessary if all the shapes were the same and they didn't need to change to be a filled in color. It was just the act of saying, I want the shape to be different or filled in, a different shape really, when I changed the parameter that made this happen. So now I have this calculation that says when the parameter is chosen equals the parameter measure name, then it's going to be true. So that allows us to have the different shapes based on whatever metric is chosen. And you can see as I switch this, it's going to change that final conditional. And then that's it. Once you put it all together and wrap it up, you get a really nice looking bar chart. The only other thing I'll go through from a formatting perspective is to say that this is all in a vertical container, and that this small line you see here is simply a blank that is put into the viz with no padding around it and of a 3 pixel height. Nothing special there. Well, we've spent about a little over 20 minutes walking through the solution. I hope you find this helpful. We'd love to hear your feedback, and thanks for tuning in.